Welcome to iPad Pros, the show all about using your iPad to be productive and get work done. I'm Tim Chen, host of the show.
Runestone is actually two things. It's a plain text editor app for iPhone and iPad, and it's an open source framework of the same name that other developers can integrate into their apps. The Vikings had these runestones, big stones that they were carving runes into, and I thought there's something here that kind of that feels like reminds me of a foundation for something. So we are building our modern world on top of this foundation established by the Vikings, and of course a lot of people before them. But it was a nice association for me a nice parallel to draw with these stones that they were carving into, and something that we are building on top of to this day. And I want other people to build on top of my framework, build their own apps.
Welcome back to another episode of iPad Pros. This is the final episode before WWDC next week, which I will be having a special episode all about next week. And I'm excited to talk about all the awesome announcements regarding iPadOS 16. So that is next week. On this episode is the developer of Jayson, Scriptable, DataJar, and now Runestone. Simon has been on episodes 61, 78, and 94. And in those episodes, we covered his other apps, including a deep dive on widgets. So check those out if you like what you're hearing today. In this episode, we are taking a deep dive on his newest app and framework, Runestone. You can learn more at Runestone.app. And if you want to support this podcast, you can head on over to patreon.com/iPadPros or subscribe to the podcast in Apple Podcasts. Well, with that, here's my interview with Simon. Enjoy. Welcome back to the podcast, Simon.
Well, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure chatting with you, Tim.
Yeah, I think this is our maybe fourth time, and this time is for a very fun special occasion of the launch of a new app that you have, Runestone.
Yeah, that's right.
So before we get started with Runestone proper, can you first kind of introduce yourself for those that haven't listened to the past episode?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Simon, and I'm a developer. I mainly make apps for iOS and iPadOS, so basically Apple's platforms. Usually have a focus on developer tools, but that's changing a bit, I would say, with the release of Runestone. I think it has a bit of a broader appeal. But yeah, I think we'll get much more into that.
Yeah, for sure. I'm not a developer, and yeah, I'm finding a lot more utility than I am with your other apps, which I do find wonderful. But as a developer, I need to kind of stretch what I can do with those,
Yeah, they're a bit more narrowly focused, so to say.
For sure, yeah. So you were last on back in October of 2020, episode 94. I'm not sure if you can remember back to October 2020, and kind of looking back between that time and now, has your iPad usage changed much since then?
That's a great question. So it has changed. I think it has changed. Back then I mostly used my iPad for taking notes and drawing. So in my day job, I have a day job where I talk to a lot of developers around like technical stuff. So it's super useful to take notes, but also to make drawings. When you need to, share a thought, it can be helpful to draw it out, or even if you have to understand something, other people, at least to me, if I have to understand something technical that other people are telling me, it helps to draw it out. So that's what I was mainly using my iPad for back then, and that's still my main use case, along with browsing, of course. The iPad's great for that, but it has changed a bit since then, because I think since 2020, two things have happened, or two new features have been announced that have really kind of spoken to me, at least. So there's Swift Playgrounds. I think it was out back then. I don't remember exactly when Swift Playgrounds was launched, but I think it's a few years ago.
Yeah.
But it has become much more powerful since then. So as a developer who's mainly developing for Apple's platforms and in the Swift programming language, this has been super helpful for me. So now I can actually make tiny apps just on my iPad. A few months ago, I wrote a small game only on or purely on the iPad. So that was new. That's something new that has happened.
That's really cool. Yeah, is that just something for yourself, or is that something available in any test flights out there?
So it is available out there as a small surprise in one of my apps.
Ooh, yes. I think this was hinted of in a review I just read on Mac Stories a couple days ago. Yeah. Curious.
So it is available, but not as a standalone app.
That's cool. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was developed purely on the iPad. The second thing that has happened since we spoke last is the introduction of universal control. So I think back then we still had back then we had what's it called? Is it called handoff? No.
We had
what's the other thing?
What's it called? The external display thing.
Sidecar. No, I was thinking about the sidecar.
Sidecar,
feature. Yeah, right. But I never really found that super useful. It's a cool feature, but it didn't really speak to me. It didn't fit into my workflow. But with the introduction of universal control, I really found that I use my iPad more, I guess, but also in different ways. So I like to use it as a second display, but not as a second display that kind of extends my computer, but where I just have it on the side, and I might have Twitter or a video open on YouTube, and then it'll just be easy to it'll be easy to use the iPad with just my mouse and keyboard, but I'll still have the true iPad experience, so to say, which I don't think you really do with Sidecar, where you're moving windows. So it feels a bit the experience is it feels a bit wrong. When you take a Mac OS window and move it to the iPad.
Totally.
But now you actually have, classic iPad apps, but you can control it with the same mouse and keyboard. And that's just been super useful to me.
That's cool, yeah. It seems like a really awesome thing for people that do use both platforms, having that one input device. And it could be either. You could be on your Magic Trackpad for iPad and have like a Mac Studio next to you, and your iPad could be controlling that. And it seems like a really, really cool way to take advantage of both platforms more natively.
Yeah, sure. I don't have a Mac Studio though. I just have a MacBook Pro. I wish I did have a Mac Studio, but that's how it is. It also works with the Mac Pro.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, sorry, MacBook Pro.
MacBook Pro, yeah. For Swift Playgrounds, like an app with like Runestone, what kind of, if you did try to build that on iPad, what kind of hurdles do you think you would have had to overcome versus doing that in Xcode?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think you could get far on the iPad. At least with like the frame of the app, so to speak, the app functionality. So where the limitations in Swift Playground is, I'm sure there are some that I can't think of right now. But at least if you have to depend on something, if you have any open source dependencies, it can be quite a hurdle. So maybe I think you're able to import Swift packages in Swift Playgrounds, but I can't remember that on top of my head. But at least with Runestone, I'm depending on some C code.
Yeah.
So an open source tool developed by GitHub for like parsing the code that's in a document and understanding the code that the user is writing in Runestone. And I don't think I'd be able to import that into Swift Playgrounds. Maybe there's a way that I'm not aware of, but I don't think that's possible.
Yeah. And then in-app purchases, I think, are not allowed yet within Playgrounds. Is that right?
Right. There might actually be something there. I don't think that's supported yet.
So it's still it's a new platform. Yeah.
Yeah. You'll still be able to develop the entire app, but once you had to implement the in-app purchases part, which is just like kind of putting up a wall in front of some of your features, you'd have to move it over to Xcode. But I think you could actually get quite far on the iPad.
Okay, yeah, very cool. Yeah, it's a cool platform being able to do this all on iPad now, and hopefully they'll advance it year to year, and we'll hear very soon here at WWDC what's going on with that.
Yeah, it's exciting to see what happens in. I guess it's under a month now. Yeah.
Yeah.
It is coming up.
So let's get to Runestone. This is a really cool app. So for those that haven't tried it yet, what is Runestone? And if you want to include in that, how did you come up with the name for the app as well?
So Runestone is a kind of a simple plain text editor. So if you're used to the Mac, you might think of a plain text editor like TextEdit.
Yeah,
that's the default plain text editor that ships with the Mac. It can, edit simple text files. Usually those files that's called like some file name .txt. You can also edit other files, but that's your like typical plain text files. There are other plain text editors for the Mac, VS Code and Nova, Sublime Text, all of those, and they have a lot of powerful features that something like TextEdit don't have. But they're all kind of plain text editors. Some of them might be leaning more towards being a full-fledged IDE, so that's a developer or a development environment where you can like compile and run your code. But at the very core of it, there's a plain text editor. So that's like that's where something like Runestone is tapping in, but on iPhone and iPad. So it's also a plain text editor for iPhone and iPad. But Runestone is actually two things. It's a plain text editor app for iPhone and iPad, and it's an open source framework of the same name that other developers can integrate into their apps. And that's how I came up with the name. So I think like being from Scandinavia, we have this association with Vikings, I think. There are other countries that have that as well. But there's this culture around Denmark, Norway, Sweden, around these Vikings. People wear these Viking helmets when they go to, not when they go to all parties, but, if they go to a soccer match, they might wear this Viking helmet. It's like, it's everywhere to some degree. Yeah. And the Vikings had these rune stones, big stones that they were carving runes into. And I thought there's something here that kind of, that feels like, that reminds me of a foundation for something. So we are building our modern world on top of this foundation established by the Vikings. And of course, a lot of people before them, but it was a nice association for me a nice parallel to draw with these stones that they were carving into, and something that we are building on top of to this day. And I want other people to build on top of my framework, build their own apps. So that's kind of how I came up with the name for the framework. And if we rewind a little, then Runestone was actually meant as an example project for that open source framework. So in the beginning, I didn't mean to release an app. I meant to release an open source framework, and I meant to use that framework in some of my other apps, namely Scriptable and Jayson. But as I was developing the framework, I needed an example project, to test out some features as I was developing them. And then just kind of along the way, I was just, this example project was turning into a full-fledged app. And it was turning into an app that I kind of wanted for my iPhone and iPad. There are other text editors out there for iPhone and iPad, and many of them are great, but this is just, it's a bit more simple, and it's built on top of Apple's default document browser. So when you open it, you'll see an interface similar to the one of the Files app. And that was it was an easy way for me to pick files in this example project. Yeah. You get that with a few lines of code, this document browser, and the user can select a file. And then as a developer, you get a chance to open it and display and edit the file. So that was like a few hours of work, and then that was set up. So that was a lot of things that I didn't have to build. And then I could focus on the editing part. I was like, when I had these two components, when I had the proof of concept for them, or maybe even when I had the small prototype of the document browser and a text editor on top of that, I was like, this is turning into something that I would want to use. And that's how the Runestone app came to be.
Very cool. And the framework, is it kind of the framework of parsing the code? Like, what aspects of the app is also the framework that others can take advantage of?
Yeah. So the framework is like that's the text view. That's where you input your text. It doesn't really have any UI except for the text view itself. It exposes a text view that other developers can integrate into their apps. And with that text view, you get support for things like syntax highlighting, showing line numbers, adding a page guide so you can see like, are my lines getting too long for my liking? Then there'll be like this vertical bar that indicates that your lines are getting long. Yeah, you'll get features to adjust the display of the text, like the line height and kerning and so on. And all of this is in the framework. And of course, this framework builds on top of the framework developed by GitHub called TreeSitter, which is responsible for understanding the code in the document. So it doesn't do the syntax highlighting, but it provides the basis for doing syntax highlighting, and Runestone provides the syntax highlighting on top of that to developers. So
I guess one natural question is, how soon does Jayson and Scriptable benefit from this framework you've built?
That's a good question. Hopefully soon, but realistically, I also want to kind of focus a bit on the launch of Runestone and improving that over the coming weeks to kind of get that in a good place. So after launching it now, I'm getting a a ton of feedback from people who want to see some very specific features or settings, or who have found a bug that I should fix. And I like to at least implement some of that.
Yeah,
I'd like to iron out all of the bugs that are there. I mean, I don't think you'll never be able to fix all bugs, I think, but at least the ones that are reported often, I'd like to kind of squash those, and then implement a few more settings that people are requesting. Maybe even some new syntaxes. So that's more programming languages in the app. But after that, I'll definitely start looking into how I can get this into Scriptable and Jayson. And with Apple's developer conference coming up in just a month, I'll also have a chance to kind of revisit the future plans for Scriptable and Jayson. And I think part of that is figuring out how do I get this text editor into those.
Yeah, I'm sure you're eagerly awaiting to see if there's going to be interactive widgets at this year's event.
I think a lot of developers are.
So are you able to share what some of the most requested settings are that people are asking for?
I think people have been requesting a lot of different settings and features, but there's some overlap. So one thing that someone requested was some way of constraining the width of the text view on the iPad. So on the iPad, the text view is full width by default. So your lines will go from the left side to the right side. But on a big iPad, like the iPad 12-inch, that might feel a bit too big. You might want to limit the width of your lines so they're easier to read, and maybe center them on the screen. And someone suggested that, and I was like, oh, that's a really good idea. And actually, it isn't that difficult for me to implement. So, I mean, I started on that this weekend, and actually, just before we started recording this, I wrapped up that feature. So that'll be in the next update. Other than that, a lot of people are requesting tabs. So there's no tabs right now. You can only open a single document. So that's also something I'll be looking into. If not soon, then I mean, at least at some point down the road.
Yeah, because you do support multi-window, which is very cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's a good start, but with multi-window, you're still really, really limited to only have two documents open at a time.
Right.
Maybe one in slide over, but that's a little awkward.
Yeah, with tabs, people want to just quickly jump between a bunch of bunch of text files that are all related to a single project, or what's the most compelling reason for the tabs?
Yeah, I think maybe for browsing or editing multiple files related to one project, but it could also be for comparing files, I would guess. Maybe copying something over from one document to another. Yeah, I think there are a lot of use cases for tabs on the iPad.
For sure. So, for those that aren't devs, what goes into all the syntax highlighting and understanding the code that is being put into a document, and why is all this stuff important? Is in text. What is all the syntax stuff all about?
Yeah. So as a developer, you're developing, right? And you do that by writing code usually. I mean, there are other means of developing. For example, in Apple's Shortcuts app, if you're making a shortcut, you're basically developing a shortcut, but that's in a visual programming language. That's in a block-based programming language, so to speak. This app is really meant for, or if you're developing in Runestone, then you're writing text. Then you're writing code. And when you write code, then you'll want to get a quick overview of what's going on in this code. You'll want the code to be easily understandable. And one way of doing that is, by adjusting the way that you write the code, ensure that you write code that is easily understandable. But another way is also having tooling that can help you easily understand your code. And the key part to that is syntax highlighting. So it'll highlight some keywords, for example. So in some programming languages, words like for, while, if, end, so on, those are keywords. And imagine that you have a document that's black text on a white background. That's your code. And then you start highlighting all the keywords. So that's the if, while, for, and so on. Well, then suddenly you'll be able to see where am I using the keywords, and you can use that to navigate in your code, right? Now, imagine you also start highlighting some other parts of your code, the variables, now they are a different color than the keywords. Well, that's another kind of visual anchor that you have in your document, and you can use that to navigate it. And when you keep doing that, then you'll kind of get another kind of visual structure around your document that makes it very easy to understand what's going on, or at least it makes it easier.
Yeah, that makes sense. A lot of sense. If people have seen The Matrix, it kind of reminds me of that a bit.
Right.
The code jumping off the screen a bit and being able to see stuff.
Yeah. It's not much different from having a document and then you make parts of it. So if you're writing a message to someone on Slack or whatever service and you want parts of it to be bold or italic, you also do that to emphasize something to the reader. And that's basically the same thing syntax highlighting is doing. It's emphasizing something to the developer.
In an automatic way, which just makes it brilliant.
Yeah.
And this is something Xcode does, like pretty much all coding tools do this?
Yeah, all coding tools have this. It's totally standard to have that in an app for writing programs.
And something I found pretty cool is that from the appearance angle, you can pick any font to be the default font for Runestone, even like a bold font, which you may not want to do that if you're writing in like Markdown where it'll show bold and italics, but you can. What other kind of important appearance things did you find necessary to include for this version 1? I
decided to include a lot of appearance settings for the app. In fact, there's a whole theme editor in the app. So when you're a developer and you have this syntax highlighting, then you can do that with various colors. There are various popular code editing themes out there. There's some named like Tomorrow, Dracula. They all have these very cool names, and some of them are very popular and are shipped with a lot of different popular code editing tools. But these are like people have their personal preferences, and some developers like to tweak these themes to their liking. And in Runestone, I shipped a complete theme editor, so you can kind of you can adjust the colors of the syntax highlighting first and foremost. So the different keywords and variables can have a color of your liking. You can actually also customize the colors of all UI components in the editor. So the navigation bar at the top and the bottoms and the UI for searching, you can choose the colors of that in this theme editor. So that's one thing I included. Then there are other settings like the line height and the kerning of the text. That's also really tied to the appearance of the app. You can also tweak that in Runestone. So I think a lot of users will like use the default settings. So I kind of try to choose some settings that I believe match a lot of people's preference. But that's just my best guess. I mean, any code editor, any plain text editor will have some defaults that they think are sensible. But I think it's very common for tools like this that you go in and tweak just, a few settings so it matches your liking. So for example, I really like that the line height in a text editor is a bit larger than usual. So I've also added that as an option in Runestone, and I set it to like 130%, which means that each line is 30% taller than the default, which is basically the height of one character. But by increasing the line height a bit, you get a bit more spacing between the lines, and I think that makes it a bit more pleasing to the eye.
Yeah, for sure. So something I heard from a developer that has been using Runestone is just how impressed they were with the performance, in that in the past, some apps that see through big, text files with a bunch of code in it, it just slow down a bunch, and that's not happening at all in Runestone. Were there challenges in making this app as performance strong as it is?
Yeah, I think that was like the challenge. In fact, I think we can record a whole podcast episode about the about tweaking the performance of Runestone. But yeah, so really there are kind of three aspects of fine-tuning the performance in Runestone. One of them might sound trivial, but that's like understanding lines. So with that
is something I found fascinating. Is just that. Yeah. As a non-developer, I was just understanding this concept of lines where I'm going to the next line, but it's not technically a new line until I hit return. And it just kind of, that was just like an aha moment. It's like, oh, each return indicates a new line, and having this app understand that is kind of very cool, actually.
Yeah, once you start diving into it, then understanding how what a text document is, that it kind of gets tricky. And one thing is understanding the lines and understanding like how long is each line in a text document. And if I'm at character 520 in this document, then what line is that on? That could be the first line, but it could also be the 100th line or the 5th line. And that's something you need to understand when you're building a text editor. And Apple doesn't really give you this by default as a developer. So I had to look at some open source code and like see what other developers are doing, and then figure out how can I do that performantly on iOS. Then, of course, another part is drawing the text. So Apple has different components for rendering text to the screen. Components for drawing text, but also frameworks for drawing text. And some of them are very high level and some of them are very low level. And I tried some of the high level components and frameworks for drawing the text, and I found that it wasn't performant enough for my needs. So I had to go very low level in Runestone to get the performance that I wanted. And then, of course, the last and third kind of big topic in this umbrella of performance in Runestone is the syntax highlighting and actually understanding the code in Runestone. And when I'm saying code, it's not necessarily like JavaScript or Swift, but it can also be Markdown files, which is not strictly code, but you're still doing some markup that Runestone needs to understand.
Yeah.
And that's where GitHub's framework Tree Setter really came into play. That's an open source framework for understanding what's going on in a document, and it's super performant when used right.
Were there any languages that were a bit harder to support that you weren't sure were going to make it for version 1?
Yeah, maybe a little actually. So as I said, Runestone is using Tree Setter for understanding the code or the text in the document, and Tree Setter is using these open source parsers or language definitions. So there are open source definitions for Markdown. So that's some rules that specify, well, if you have a Markdown document and you apply these rules, then you can kind of understand what's going on in the document. Yeah, and those exist for Markdown, JavaScript, PHP, all sorts of languages. So, I mean, in some sense, I'm, in quotes, just using open source code to understand what's going on in Runestone. And in that sense, it was quite easy, and it was equally easy for all languages. There's one language that was a bit more tricky than others, though, and that was actually Swift.
Figures.
Swift is a very complicated, it's a complex language. I'm sure there are other as complex languages out there, but maybe I'm just not supporting them in Runestone yet. But it is a very large language with a large grammar. And opening a Swift document in Runestone can be a bit more heavy than opening other documents, simply because I need to load in this parser for understanding what's going on in the document. And that takes a bit longer than for other languages, so I'm doing some tricks there to speed it up a bit.
Gotcha, yeah. And what language do you find yourself using most often?
I'm most often using Markdown. I like to edit Markdown files in Runestone. I'm often using JavaScript. I have a kind of a love for JavaScript. I think in previous episodes we've talked about Scriptable, this app for writing JavaScript. So I am using Runestone for writing some JavaScript, and then for browsing JSON files. So occasionally I'll get a JSON file sent over from a coworker in my day-to-day job, and I'll usually view that in either my Jayson app, so this app specifically meant for viewing JSON files, or I'll view it in Runestone. And admittedly, the past few months I've probably mostly used Runestone to kind of exercise the app and figure out where are the things that I need to tweak. So kind of stress testing it in some sense.
Yeah.
That's at least 3 languages that I'm using Runestone with.
Very cool. And we talked earlier about the concept of lines and how each return makes it a new line. I noticed this ability to vertical and horizontal overscroll. Can you explain the overscroll ability and even the ability to even horizontally scroll, which is a bit different.
So on iOS, we are not really familiar with this concept of horizontal scrolling in text documents. So take, for example, Apple's Notes app. If you write a huge note and if you have long lines, then the text will wrap to the next line. So one line is shown as multiple line fragments, so to speak. So when you hit enter, you start a new line, but if your line is too long, then it's still wrapped to another line fragment. Some code editors work that way, and a lot of code editors don't. So if you're writing code, then you probably want, or you don't necessarily want long lines, but if you have a long line, then you'll want it to be rendered as a single line and then horizontal, and then enable horizontal scrolling, so you can kind of scroll to the end of that line. So I had to support that in Runestone. Of course, you can toggle that setting on and off. I think if you're writing a Markdown document, then you probably don't want horizontal scrolling. Then you probably want the default behavior with line wrapping enabled.
Yeah.
Then there's the Overscroll feature, which was actually something that a user, or actually a few users, requested during the beta. It's this feature where you make the scrollable area a bit larger. So imagine that you're scrolling a document and then you reach the end, and then the last line of that document will be at the bottom of the screen if you're scrolling vertically. Yeah. If you add some overscroll, then you'll be able to scroll a bit longer than the document, than the height of the document. So if you add like a 50% overscroll, then the last line of the document will be able to scroll to the middle of the screen, which can make it a bit more pleasant to read the bottom of a document if you don't have to move your eyes to the bottom of the screen.
That's smart.
Yeah. And the same thing for horizontal overscroll. I think the most common overscroll is vertical, but when I was adding the feature, I was like, I might as well add horizontal overscroll if anyone wants that.
Yeah.
And this is actually a feature that's quite common, I would say, in code editors, but I'm not sure it's really that common in other plain text editors or other text editors in general. Like, I don't think the Notes app has it, for example.
Yeah, I think like in Pages, I remember often just hitting return so I could do that and have these empty lines just so I could have it more comfortable.
Right.
So have you considered presets for these kind of settings based on the file type as an option?
The short answer is yes. I have considered that, and I mean, I hope to support it one day, but it comes with some added complexity of maintaining multiple sets of settings. But it's certainly possible to implement. I think my main concern is like my main concern is not how do I implement it from a technical point
How
of
do you
view,
not confuse people?
but it's like, exactly, how do I implement the UI for this? What's the proper UI here? I don't think that's as straightforward, especially not on an iOS app where we are used to one setting screen for adjusting the settings globally. But once you start adding per file type settings, then of course you're using the same setting screen, but you're really adding multiple levels of settings here. And I mean, it's how do you do that well? I don't know. I'll have to think about that a bit.
Yeah. So something I'm curious about is, so apps like Playgrounds, you're writing code and able to see the results of that code right then and there, either in like the Swift UI preview or the demo app that it lets you run. In an app like Runestone, what's kind of the workflow for seeing if the code you've written is doing what it needs to do? I
mean, the boring and the short answer is that there is none, or at least that it's not something that Runestone is concerned about. Very much in like the same way that text edit on the Mac isn't concerned about where your text goes afterwards.
Yeah.
So you might draft up a message or an email in text edit, but you're not able to send the email. Or you might edit a code file, but you're not able to compile or run that code. And Runestone is it's developed from the same point of view, that I want to make a great plain text editor. And what you do with that text isn't really something that Runestone cares about. That's not to say that it's not something that could be added in the future, but at least for now, it's not really. It hasn't been my goal. The goal has been to make an app that works with a broad range of programming languages and doesn't go too deep into specific languages. So if you want to run code, if you want to run some Swift code, then you'll need to embed the Swift compiler and so on. And if you want to preview some HTML, well, then you'll need to develop functionality specific for that. If you want to preview some HTML, you need to develop features specifically for that. But it could also be if you want to preview a Markdown file, you need something that can convert that to maybe HTML and then preview that. So it's like when you kind of want to take it to the next level, then it's very specific for each programming language. You can't use the Swift compiler to compile PHP or to run Python. So once you start kind of looking into that, you need to go deep on each specific programming language.
It becomes like 20 different apps, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's a huge effort, but it's also like, what are you really doing? I think doing that, I would be afraid of doing 20 things either bad or mediocre instead of kind of focusing on the core that I want to do well.
Yeah, the HTML previews is something that I personally would like to see the most as a non-developer, but someone that can dabble in HTML stuff. And there's a lacking in iOS. I think we used to have Diet Coda that was like the perfect app for this, where you could write HTML and preview it. And there's all sorts of cool ideas with being able to like write HTML and it live updating on like an external monitor or secondary window within iPad OS. But I don't know if that's ever something you do one day.
Well, maybe. I'll never say never, but it hasn't been the focus now. I think if there's a lot of demand for this, then I could see it happen. So if I can see that a lot of users would benefit from this feature, then it might make sense for me to go deep on HTML and really improving the support for the HTML. But I don't want Runestone to turn into an app for editing HTML.
Yeah, exactly.
I want it to be an app for editing plain text files that then maybe happens to have some HTML specific features. So I just think there's a balance to be found here.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it's not an HTML app. It includes that, but it's one of many apps. Yeah. Or it's one app that includes all these different languages, and treating them all equally is I think a good thing right now.
Yeah, that's the plan for now at least.
So for those that aren't developers, there's still a lot to love about this app, and the free version that you download is actually really great if you're not a developer. As we'll talk about the premium stuff a little bit later. So what aspects of the app are you most proud of for those that aren't coding with it? I know for me, I found the search just really stellar. That find and replace ability is just a great UI for that.
I think that would also be the feature that I would highlight here. Yeah, so I spent a lot of time on the search functionality, and I wanted to make it in a way where you could still view your document while you were searching and while you were replacing text in the document. This is very similar of how text editors work on the Mac, where you'll usually have search and replace on the left or right hand side, and then your document in the middle of the screen, or you might have search and replace at the top. But at least you'll always have your view kind of split into two, so you can always see what's going on in your document while you're searching and while you're replacing. And I wanted to bring that over to Runestone. In general, I've been very inspired by various Mac text editors or text editors for the Mac as I was developing this, and I thought it would be fun to see like how can I do something new around search and replace in this app, or at least something that might be new to iOS but which feels a bit more familiar on Mac. So I'm glad that you're highlighting that. as one thing that you like in the app. Other than that, I think the performance of the app is something that I hope a lot of people will appreciate, no matter if you're a developer or not. So I think if you are a non-developer, you might also have some large text documents that you need to open, and I hope that Runestone can handle those. And then, of course, I really like, also from a non-developer point of view, that Runestone is built on this default document browser that Apple provides. So it'll be, instantly familiar to anyone using or anyone who have previously used the Files app on iOS and iPad OS.
For sure. And I do love when you create a new document within Runestone, it actually asks you, what should the file name be? Because a lot of apps, you just, we have a new file and you can name it later if you want to.
Yeah, it's actually fun because that's something I've gotten. A few users at least have written me feedback about this in particular. I think some like it. Usually you don't hear from people who like a particular small feature. You hear from those who don't like it. And I have heard from a few people who would actually prefer the way that you're describing, where you just create a new app and then it has a default name like Untitled.txt or something like that, and then you can get going. And then you might use it for a scratch pad, right, or something that's never saved. So I could see that being a setting that I would look into in the future. Where, like, do you want to be prompted right away to enter a file name, or do you just want to use a default file name?
Right,
I think those are two different use cases that might make sense to accommodate in one app via a setting.
Right. And something I noticed is it kind of defaults to plain text, which makes sense for this app. And I was trying to figure out, what's the Markdown extension? How do I get to Markdown? Is there a Markdown extension? I know you can do it in the UI after you're working in plain text already, but what's the proper way to do that?
The Markdown extension is .md for Markdown. And if you're creating a Markdown file in Runestone, you'll have to enter your file name and then type .md. There's also a setting to make it default to any file extension that you might prefer. So you could tell it to specify .md for all new files that you create, or .js for JavaScript, or whatever. And this is actually something that I've also gotten some feedback on, which honestly surprised me a little, but maybe in a positive way. But at least it was a bit curious to me that I got this feedback, because on the Mac, when you create a new file in a code editor or a text editor, you'll often just be presented with a similar UI where you just enter a file name and then whatever extension.
Yeah.
But several people, or a handful of people maybe, have written to me that they, just like you, they might not know the extension of the file that they're actually interested in creating.
Yeah, initially I was trying .mkd. It's like, that might be Markdown. Yeah. And then I Googled, what's the Markdown file extension? I couldn't find it.
Yeah, but it's .md. But if you're familiar to Markdown editors that handles this for you, then I can see why that's confusing, that all of a sudden you're expected to know this extension yourself. I just think, as a developer, the way that Runestone is doing it now feels natural to me, because I'm familiar. I'm used to writing my file extension myself,
yeah.
And I think most developers are. But I can also see that with Runestone hopefully having a broader appeal, then that might not be the right way to do it, to expect people to write the file extension themselves. I might need to add some sort of drop down or some kind of UI to select the file extension of the file you're creating.
Yeah, because a little bit later I did discover you can tap on the file name once you're in it and change it to Markdown. I don't know, is there benefits to having the right file extension? Like, if I'm working in plain text and I change it to like Swift, will that cause problems?
Yeah, so interestingly, tapping the file name in the editor and changing the language doesn't actually change the file extension.
Right.
So if you create a file called helloworld.md for a Markdown file, you open it and you start writing Markdown, and you change the language to, say, JavaScript. Mm-hmm. Then it will not rename the file to helloworld.js. Instead, it will reinterpret the file as JavaScript. So that's really meant for the cases where Runestone is unable to guess the contents of your file. So usually these code editors will look at the file extension to guess what's in the file, but sometimes you're creating files with different file extensions, or maybe they don't even have a file extension at all, but they still contain some text that can be interpreted using some programming language. So popular examples of this include, like, people familiar to iOS development will know that we have this concept of Fastlane, which uses Ruby files, and some of these Ruby files don't have a file extension, but they just contain Ruby. And then Runestone cannot guess the contents of the file, but you can manually select that it's Ruby, and then you'll have the content syntax highlighted.
Gotcha. Yeah. And with Markdown, is there downside in having it being a TXT file versus a Markdown file?
No, not at all. The main benefit of using the .md file extension will be to signify to Runestone and other text editors that this is a Markdown file, and they should interpret it as Markdown.
Okay.
I mean, I think that's broadly what file extensions are for, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, it was a fun thing as a kid when I discovered I can just change extensions, and sometimes it would work, and it's like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So is Runestone an app you're using now to write code for different projects you're doing?
No. The short answer is no.
Yeah.
So Runestone was mainly developed for integrating into other apps, right? So it was developed as this open source framework. So I intend to implement it in some of my other apps like Scriptable and Jayson. But yeah, so what am I actually using Runestone for, you might ask? And I use Runestone for like this occasional editing of files, which occasional happens to be quite often. But it's like if someone shares a file with me, typically via Slack, can be some code snippet or it can be a JSON file, then I'll need some way to view this file and probably also edit it. And I'll use Runestone for that. So that's my main use of apps like Runestone on my iPhone and iPad. But I hear from people who use it in different ways. Like I think some people are using their iPhone and iPad to develop more on than I am, honestly. And those are benefiting from an app like Runestone. I can clearly tell from the feedback I'm getting.
Yeah. As you were talking there, I was just thinking how cool of a next step for universal control would it be if you could right click on a file on your Mac and say open in Runestone on iPad, or it'd have like an iPad section and you could just open files on the iPad next to you. I think that'd be really nifty if Apple would add that, or some third party could figure out how to implement some kind of plugin for that.
Yeah. I guess that would be possible. That would be fun.
Yeah, for sure. Any other developer-focused features that are important to point out before you start the wrap up?
Yeah, I think we have kind of touched on a lot of them. I don't know if we have mentioned like line numbers, so you can see what line you're on, or like you can see the line number of any line, basically. Those are important when you're writing code. It can show invisible characters, which can be helpful for some developers, so you can see where are the tabs and spaces and line breaks and so on in your code. There's the page guide, so you can tell if your lines are getting too long, and there's a whole tool for formatting your code. So if you're writing some JavaScript, and or if you're opening someone else's JavaScript file and it doesn't really suit your coding style, then you can format it using Runestone and have it like reinterpret the file and write it to disk in a format that you prefer. So that's things like where are the line breaks and how long should my lines be and so on. There are a ton of different settings for developers that we could dive into.
Very cool. And then we touched on the fact that you can just download this for free, and if you're not a developer, you'll get a lot out of this. And as a non-developer, you also get some cool app icons and some other customizability features. But what is kind of the $10 upgrade? What do you get with this premium upgrade?
So that's most of the things that I covered previously. So the line numbers, invisible characters, page guide, formatting, so on. So basically, I wanted to give people the core text editor for free, so they can try it out. They can see that syntax highlighting works, that search and replace is fast and reliable. It can handle big documents and so on. But if you want to personalize the app, so if you want to if you want to design your own theme, or if you want to tweak the line height or kerning or something like that, then you'll need to pay or to unlock the premium purchase. Basically, then the app is free, but some of the nitty-gritty settings require the purchase.
Yeah, and it doesn't really bother you with the fact that you're on the free one. If you don't even make your way into the settings app, you may think that's all there is. Yeah. And then anything else that we haven't covered they'd like to before we wrap it up?
No, I think that's it.
Very cool. Where can people find more information about Runestone?
You can go to Runestone.app to find out, like, there's a small text document showing like why I developed the app. There are links for the open source framework on GitHub and to the App Store and so on. And then, of course, if you're interested in the development of Runestone, you can follow me on Twitter, where I'm at Simon BS, and I occasionally tweet about like upcoming features and ask people for their opinion about like should I do A or B in Runestone, so on.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Simon, for your time today. It's been great chatting and learning more about this awesome new app.
Sure, it's been great chatting with you, and thank you for having me again.
Well, that was my interview with Simon. My thanks to Simon for his time recording this interview, and my thanks to you for your time and attention tuning in. If you'd like to support this podcast, head over to patreon.com/iPadPros, or you can subscribe to the podcast either monthly or yearly in Apple Podcasts. With that, I'll talk to everyone next week for a very exciting WWDC episode.